Hello, everyone. We'll get started in just a second as we're waiting for everyone to come in from the waiting room. You should be automatically muted. If you unmute yourself, please go ahead and mute yourself now. We have a lot of people on this call, and it will make it easier if everyone is muted, and only the speakers are going to be able to be heard. So we'll just be getting started in 1 second. Just a quick note, everyone, we are recording. You should have gotten a note to that effect when we started. And we are also on Facebook Live. So if you, for whatever reason, get booted from this call, you should be able to watch it on there. All right, so we're gonna have just a few more people are joining us. So give a second for them all to get in and we will get started. All right, with that, I'm gonna hand it over to Whitney Demetrius to get us started. Whitney, go ahead.
Thanks so much, Dana, and welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for being here as part of this conversation. And thank you again on behalf of CHAPA and Massachusetts Housing Partnership, MHP, and DHCD, Department of Housing and Community Development. So please note, as Dana mentioned, for those who just joined, this session is being recorded and is available on Facebook Live. We have so many people joining us today, so we do ask that you mute yourself and definitely pose your questions that you have in the chat. We'll be moderating that throughout today's conversation. As some of you all know, this is a follow-up to our initial conversation we had back in April. And so since then, there's been a lot of work done and a lot of lessons learned. So excited about today's conversation to both hear from you all and from our esteemed panelists. First, we'll be hearing from Amy Mullen and Kristen Haas from DHCD on some state updates. And then we'll hear from Katie Bossy from MHP on some local programs that have emerged. Finally, we'll be having a panel discussion with our speakers that Dana will be moderating, including Stephanie Cox from the Regional Housing Network of Massachusetts, John Hornick from the Amherst Affordable Housing Trust, Alex Train from the City of Chelsea, Aaron Zwerko from the town of Arlington. And, you know, there will be time for questions at the end. Chris Kletchman from DHCD will be moderating that question and answer portion. So please do feel free to put your questions in the chat function. Again, this session is recorded, and so we will be posting a recording of the session on our website and sharing all the contact information for our speakers and such, and links to resources, and everything will be available on the website, as well as our former session back in April was available as well, if you'd like to tune into that as well. So before we get started, we're going to do a quick poll to see who is joining us today. So I'm going to administer that now, and I'll look for some indication that you all can see it. Head nod. So if you can, I want to get a sense of who is on our call today. We have some upwards to 600 plus folks engaged in this conversation, and we know this is a conversation that many are interested in having and hearing some best practices and lessons learned. So I can see attendees are answering the questions, and we are almost there in terms of responses. Then I'll stop the poll so we get a sense of who is in the room. All right, so let's see. I'm going to share these results so that you guys can see it along with me. So where are you joining us from? Many of you all, 43%, are from Greater Boston. Happy to see that we have folks from the Cape and Islands and the South Shore, as well as the North Shore. What's great about these sessions is that we're able to be far-reaching when we have these sort of talks. So this is excellent. Fall River and New Bedford, 1%. Metro West, Central Mass. So glad to see so many of you all from all the different regions in Massachusetts on today's call. And 2% outside of Massachusetts, and that's always great to see as well. So what is your role? many of us, 17% are local municipal employees, 10% state and federal government employees, and 37% nonprofit and housing organizations. That's exciting to see. 5% policy, 3% community residents, some researchers on the call, and others. So happy to see so many of you all engaged in this conversation. Excited to hear from our panelists as well as from all of you. And I will turn it back over to Dana to get us going. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Whitney. So folks, we're gonna go right into the program because we have a lot of stuff to cover today. So first we're gonna hear from Amy Mullen and Kristen Haas. They are with DHCD, and they're gonna give us some updates on the scope of all the programs being offered at the state level. So Amy and Kristen, I will hand it off to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Dana, and hi everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So as many of you may know, DHCD's initial response to the pandemic on the emergency rental assistance side has been twofold. So one, we expanded our existing emergency prevention program, RAFT, which has been around for quite a while. And two, we've created a new program for households with higher income levels, ERMA. So on the RAFT side, we were grateful to receive $5 million from Mass Housing right at the very beginning of the pandemic that allowed us to immediately expand the program. The initial expansion included some policies to make RAFT more flexible, easier to access in this new world of remote services. So we were lucky in that because RAFT was an existing program, it was fairly easy to immediately add funds. It wasn't without its challenges, which we'll talk about during the panel, but we were able to kind of get things going pretty quickly and then make some more substantial policy changes later on. So that's kind of one piece of our state offering, the RAFT program, and then my colleague Kristen is going to talk about the new ERMA program.
Great, thanks Amy. Hi everybody. So ERMA stands for Emergency Rental and Mortgage Assistance. DHCD can never resist a good acronym. So as many of you probably already know, ERMA is a new $20 million program that DHCD launched on July 1st using federal CARES Act funding. The ERMA program is for households with incomes between 50 and 80% of area median income. So like Amy said, it's serving a slightly higher income group than the RAFT program had been serving. And the ERMA program can help households who are behind on their rent or mortgage, or who are going to be unable to pay their rent or mortgage in upcoming months. So it can basically help pay for arrears or stipends. And the ERMA program is being administered by the same 11 regional administering agencies as RAFT, and the two programs are actually using a joint application. And just in terms of kind of the conversations happening at the state level more broadly, we just wanted to say that DHCD and the Executive Office of Housing and Economic Development and the courts are all working really hard to figure out, what policies and programs need to be in place to avoid a major housing crisis. So we're trying to collaborate with all the different stakeholders, tenant groups, legal services, landlord groups, to understand everyone's priorities and, sort of try to create an ecosystem of supports for tenants, homeowners, and landlords. So we just kind of want to say stay tuned in the coming weeks about, potential policy changes or new initiatives.
Thank you, Amy and Kristen, so much, and we'll hear more from you when we get into our panel discussion. Now we want to hear from Katie Bossy from the Massachusetts Housing Partnership, MHP. She's going to give us an overview of some of the local programs and the database that we've been working on. So hand it over to Katie.
Thanks, Dana, and hello, everyone. I'm going to just take a minute to share my screen real quick. There we go. Okay, so MHP, along with CHAPA and DHCD, is currently tracking local emergency rental assistance programs as they emerge and evolve throughout the state in a central database. And I'm sharing my screen here so I can show you where it lives. It lives on the Housing Toolbox website. And the database expanded from a survey that we dispersed back in May by the same team, MHP, CHAPA, and DHCD. And there are two goals to provide a space where communities can kind of learn from each other and how one another is responding to the crisis right now with housing assistance. And also to inform the state just how much local resources are being allocated to emergency rental assistance right now. So I just wanted to show you this because you can find more information on kind of the background of the database and some of the earlier work that was done for emergency rental assistance here on the toolbox that Whitney mentioned in the beginning. But for now, I'll bring you to the database and show you what it looks like. So this is kind of the information. This is the information we're tracking. If we all can see this, we are tracking what municipalities. Some of them are regional, like Barnstable County, administrating agency, and then the more nitty-gritty of the programs. How much are they allocating? How max assistance per household, and area median income. So I just wanted to provide everyone with a high-level stats of where we're at right now with the database. And Dana, I believe, will be sharing the infographic later that we updated for September. But for now, I just wanted to share 89 communities, including some of the regional efforts like on the Cape.
Caitlin, make sure you wash your hands.
In Western Mass have implemented a program. There's been over $33 million pledged with all the communities included at this point. A majority of the communities are still allocating money from Community Preservation Act and Municipal Affordable Housing Trust dollars. And a majority of the programs are targeting households up to 80% area median income. And then secondly, households up to 100% area median income. The average assistance is this month around, with the added programs we've added since August, is about $4,000 per household. And then the last point I just wanted to share is when you look through the database, you'll see that the amount allocated ranges from $15,000 to $8 million in Boston. So there's quite a range, and I think all of us want to make a point that you don't need $100,000 to allocate a program. Communities are doing it at all different levels. So that's kind of where we're at for September. The last thing I'll add is we are trying to keep this database as accurate as possible. So if you see anything that says not specified or that might look inaccurate or needs to be updated, you can come to the top of the database and there's a form to link to a Google form, which I can show you here. And you can just either email me or fill out this form and kind of give us an update of where your community's at or any changes that might happen so we can keep this as accurate as possible. That's all for me, and feel free to reach out to me or my colleague Shelly Gehring, who's been leading the efforts at MHP around emergency rental assistance. And I'll bring it back to Dana.
Thank you, Katie, so much. And just if you could, there you go, unstir your screen. Thank you so much. All right, so thank you, Amy and Kristen and Katie for getting us started here with some, big scope items. I'm gonna add in now our other folks who are on our call who are joining us. I'm gonna give a quick introduction of all of them, and then we're gonna jump right into our discussion. So we've already heard from Katie and Kristen and Amy, and joining us as well is Stephanie Cox from the Regional Housing Network of Massachusetts. We have John Hornick from the Amherst Affordable Housing Trust and also the Amherst Affordable Housing Coalition. We have Alex Train from the city of Chelsea. We have Erin Zwerko from the town of Arlington. And also on the call is Chris Kletchman from DHCD, who's going to be monitoring your questions. So as we said, as we're going through the moderated discussion, please post your questions in the chat. I've already seen questions being asked and answered, but if there are questions that you want to pose to the panelists, we will be saving time for that at the end. So let's jump right into our moderated discussion. So We're going to start at the beginning, like all of you have and have to, which is how did you determine the priority and focus of your program? And were there any examples or guidance that you were looking to as you did this work? So let's start with Alex from Chelsea. Alex, if you could respond to that.
Great. Hi, everyone. So my name is Alex. I am the Director of Housing and Community Development with the City of Chelsea. So the City of Chelsea, in conjunction with our Community Preservation Committee and Affordable Housing Trust Fund, appropriated funds and established an emergency rental program during sort of the early days of COVID-19. The program is really anchored by a number of key priorities in order to ensure the sort of responsiveness of the program to our population. First and foremost, because we have a sizable undocumented population that we proudly serve in Chelsea, we wanted to ensure that we crafted a program that was easily accessible, did not constitute a public charge, and was able to serve residents of Chelsea that may not be eligible for other forms of public assistance. So we intentionally designed our program both from a marketing perspective as well as from sort of a mechanics perspective to effectively serve those residents. I think second, a major priority that we sort of designed the program around relates to subleasing. Our program was heavily utilized by traditional tenants. In the case of Chelsea, because of the ongoing affordability crisis, we've increasingly witnessed subleasing occurring where residents are renting rooms from other residents. We wanted to ensure that those households, despite the fact that they are, informal tenancies, are able to be served. So those were the sort of two major sort of priorities that the program was developed around in terms of servicing populations. I would say, lastly, one of our sort of guiding principles as we created this program really related to barriers to access. All of our program materials were developed in a sort of bilingual fashion. They were highly visual. They did not use technical language. And we partnered with community-based organizations in order to disseminate information about program eligibility and the application process to make it a little less intimidating for residents. Oftentimes, we're approached by residents who are interested in applying for state programs, but can't wrap their head around it because of the sort of sizable amount of regulations and procedural steps. So we were very deliberate about simplifying a process for residents that could, get them the resources they need as quickly as possible without much bureaucratic red tape. So that more or less were sort of the main priorities that went into sort of how our program was developed.
Thank you, Alex. Erin, do you want to fill us in on how the town of Arlington developed your program?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Erin Zwerko from the town of Arlington. The town of Arlington, as an entitlement community receiving CDBG funds, Community Development Block Grant funds, we received an additional award through the CARES Act of just under $660,000, with which we allocated $400,000 towards rental assistance. I will also note that our CPA committee has provided a grant of an additional $300,000 that we have not yet tapped into. We're still working our way through the CDBG funds, which I'll focus on. So the staff in the department had developed the original outline of the program, and we had intended to cast as wide a net as possible. So we were looking to go up to 80% of the area median income and provide up to $4,000 in rental assistance per month for no more than 3 months in compliance with the CDBG regulations. Our initial plan was limited in scope by our CDBG subcommittee, which is an advisory group to the CDBG administrator. And they recommended limiting the eligibility to households earning up to 50% of the area median income, and also limiting the rental assistance to $2,000 per month for no more than 3 months, so a total of $6,000. And that's what we ultimately went with, and that's what our select board ultimately approved as part of our application, our substantial amendment to HUD in order to program the funding. We had looked to a number of communities in the greater Boston area that were a little bit ahead of us in how we developed this program. Arlington is part of a home consortium that's based out of Malden. Malden is the representative member, and there are, including Arlington and Malden, Revere and Medford are also entitlement communities in that consortium. So I had looked at quite a bit of the information that Malden had prepared because it was helpful. And when you're trying to get a program off the ground quickly and with a little bit of pressure, it was helpful to have that background information and you know, a format to work from. So thanks, Malden. I know Alex is on the call, but and like Alex in Chelsea had mentioned, we had looked intentionally to translate documents. This was the first intentional effort that we made to translate documents for the community to make sure that they were that we were enabling all community members to apply for this fund without much limitations. And then the last thing that I'll just mention is that at the same time, the Housing Corporation of Arlington and our Health and Human Services Charitable Corporation were also launching relief funds. So trying to work with those administrators to ensure that we overlapped in some cases, but then provided additional services in other cases was important so that we could provide as much assistance and as much targeted assistance to the community members in need.
Thank you, Erin. And I know you said you looked at some communities like Malden. If you go, for folks who are still developing programs or are thinking about making changes to your programs, the database that Katie had identified and walked you through at the beginning should show folks a lot of the documents are on there or on other people's websites and contact information. So if you wanted to reach out to any of these folks, you could follow up with them. John, do you want to tell us, I know you guys had slightly different priority categories in Amherst, so I'd love to hear from you on how you determined the priority and focus of your program.
Okay, thanks, Dana. I'll just briefly give a nod to Shelley Goring, whom we turned to because there really weren't many examples out there, and Shelley was aware of what was going on. So that was really helpful to us. There was also a statewide meeting where people talked about their plans and development that gave us some ideas as well. We basically settled on a eligibility of 80% AMI with a priority for households with young children, or I should say with children. Let's see. We committed about $250,000. We thought that could serve 60 to 80 households. These came from the Amherst Affordable Housing Trust. They were funds, though, that originated with Community Preservation Act, so we were bound by those requirements. We offered up to 3 months of support, which would be roughly 50% of rent for 3 months, which could include arrears. The amount was also dependent on household size. The program has been administered by Community Action Pioneer Valley, which acts as also the local HUD COC coordinator and administers other federal and state public assistance programs. Let's see. We have done one round and we're about to start a second round. The first round started in mid-June and ended in early August. Because we wanted a priority on families, we had a lottery plan for the end of the round that would enable us to give us priority for families. I'll talk about how that worked out in a few minutes. I will say that we're making a number of changes for round 2 based on what we learned in round 1. Overall, in round 1, we had a total of 104 applications. They came through an online mechanism. 44 of these were incomplete, another 42 were ineligible or denied, and only 18 were approved, which quite honestly was disappointing to us. So we've looked at what we thought were some of the obstacles, and we're planning in round 2 to make some changes that we hope will overcome those. I'll get to those later. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Yeah, I think that's been a common theme of, you know, do your best effort up front and be prepared to make changes. Speaking of changes, I wanted to go to the folks who administer RAFT, to Amy and to Stephanie through your work with the regional agencies. You know, given that there were existing programs like RAFT already out there, but this was a new situation that we were all faced with, what were some of the changes you made to the application and the requirements to streamline that process? Maybe let's start with Amy to respond to that question.
Yeah, so yeah, like you said, I mean, because RAFT already existed, that was a huge benefit for us. It was already in place. We already had the staff through the 11 regional nonprofits who were, you know, already spending all their time working on RAFT applications. And the existing RAFT program was already geared towards the exact same kinds of housing emergencies that we're now seeing during COVID. The big difference, though, is that, of course, during COVID, the demand is a lot higher because there are a lot more people facing housing instability that, you know, maybe had never even been at risk of homelessness before. So our task, along with the RAAs and the RHN, has been to meet that higher demand and react to the fact that there was this moratorium and is this moratorium on evictions. So that piece definitely required some policy changes, since we used to only pay arrears through RAFT for folks who were already at the court eviction stage. And now we were having a lot of people losing income and falling behind, but they were never going to have a court eviction or they didn't have a court eviction yet because of the moratorium. So we were sort of able to change our internal DHCD policies to allow those folks to access RAFT before the court stage. So I will just mention briefly a few of the changes we made. We were able to create a new, shorter joint application for RAFT and IRMA. We introduced some new flexible documentation policies to sort of allowing the RAA staff to waive documentation if families couldn't provide it, couldn't find it. We allowed online signatures or e-signatures, which has enabled the RAAs, some of the RAAs, to do online applications as well. We allowed, like I said, the payment of rent arrears to be accessed outside of court, and allowed income self-certification as well, and excluded the CARES Act unemployment payments. We kind of anticipated that getting that extra $600 a week would probably put a lot of people over income for RAFT, which is kind of counterintuitive to what I think both programs were trying to do. So we excluded that so that they wouldn't count towards someone's gross income. I'll also just say briefly that we're definitely still discussing new ideas along with the RHN. We'll hear from Stephanie in a second, to improve the application process as we move forward, particularly thinking about the demand we're anticipating for when the moratorium ends.
Thanks, Amy. Stephanie?
Yeah, so as Amy said, we've worked closely with DHCD on recommendations on how to streamline the process. Certainly when you're taking a program that was designed to be a small program, designed for a small subset of the population, and then scaling it to the level that we're talking about. Originally, the program as designed required a lot of hand-holding, you know, as evidenced by kind of, you know, John's experience of having incomplete applications or ineligibility. And certainly the more complex that you make an application or a documentation process or any of these types of things, the more hand-holding that it requires on sort of the staffing level. So I'm answering these questions kind of from the perspective of assuming that there are going to be people who are either looking at designing or redesigning their existing programs. So kind of bearing that in mind, you know, 90% of the slowdown comes on the documentation piece. You know, if you're looking for documentation relative to people's identification, their family members, et cetera, You know, I joke about it, but I'm completely serious. I couldn't find my social security card if you paid me. So the time that takes for people, and they get, you know, half of the documentation, but not all, that really slows down the process. And then on the income side, again, getting it for sort of every family member, that can also really slow this down. And so I think if you take a look at some of the programs, such as like the home program, coming through, you know, the home agencies, that some of the RAAs are administering, you know, you'll find they're allowing for self-certification right off the bat, you know, I think you'll find that those funds are going to go like that, right? So basically, sort of from an advice perspective, I think the takeaway that we have is that the longer, the more complex the application, as well as the documentation process, the slower it's going to go, right? And the more restrictions you put around who can access it and sort of levels of priority and whatnot, that also slows down that process and creates greater complication. And again, when we're trying to kind of scale, we have to think about that as competing priorities.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it leads me to my next question, which is promoting the program. So there's, you know, the time it takes to get people through the process and applying and getting them approved, but there's also how you're making sure people are coming in the door, promoting the program, and particularly reaching out to tenants that are most vulnerable. I think, Alex, you spoke to this a bit in making sure things were bilingual, but could you speak a little bit more, Stephanie, since I've got you there, about how the regional agencies are promoting and getting tenants who are really vulnerable due to a digital divide, language barriers, other issues in the door?
Yeah, absolutely. So first I'll say that we are working in conjunction with DHCD and other partners on sort of a statewide communications approach to all of this. So that's one piece, but then I think regionally individual RAAs have been reaching out through a variety of means, through doing Facebook ads, through community partners, through PSAs and radio. So kind of a variety, and then also making sure that there is a language access plan for each regional agency, and that there's, you know, translated it into 7 different languages, that there's someone that people can connect with that can help them walk through the process in their language. But I think that there's still work to do on that. And, you know, we welcome any partners who want to help us get the word out as we launch a statewide approach to this.
Thanks. Alex, do you want to share any more ideas of how you guys are promoting your program and getting it out there?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dana. So for each program that we run out of this office, you know, we develop a tailored communication strategy that we end up using throughout the duration of the respective program. In this instance, because our income limits were set at 50% AMI, you know, it was really encompassing a broad swath of the Chelsea population. In Chelsea, over 73% of housing units are inhabited by renters. There are a handful of social service agencies in the community that work quite closely with tenants on, you know your rights trainings, landlord tenant disputes, and anti-displacement matters. So one of the sort of techniques we utilized was to closely engage with some of our community partners, which is kind of par for the course on many of our projects. But in this instance, some of our community partners were assisting residents with the application process, walking them through how to fill out the application, how to define what certain, parts of the grant agreement meant. They were really crucial at connecting the city and our staff in the department to some of the more hidden populations in Chelsea. I think the other strategy that we utilized that was relatively successful was that we run a series of food pantries in Chelsea that the city actually manages. So we would both conduct outreach at those locations and conduct outreach at the COVID-19 testing centers in Chelsea in order to attract people to the program who may be there for other types of services. So definitely sort of scanning the landscape of your community to look to see what other forms of services may be offered that may be popular with residents. Unfortunately, in this sort of economic era, emergency food assistance is the big one. But working with members of the faith community and members of nonprofit and community-based organizations has been highly effective for our program.
Thanks. John or Aaron, do you want to add anything to how you guys are promoting your programs and getting it out there?
I would just quickly add that we worked with the superintendent of the public school system to make sure that the information got out through her school newsletters. And the library put out information through their newsletters about our rental assistance program. And I think it with the superintendent, of course, it went to families with school-age children. But the library newsletter might have had a wider reach, and we might have actually also hit some landlords that might be willing to work with their tenants to apply, although the application was for the tenant to fill out.
I'll just add that we did outreach to about a dozen organizations. Some, frankly, did a better job than others at assisting us. We didn't get the cooperation we hoped to from the schools, and so I'm going to make another run at that, certainly for round 2, as well as some of the other organizations that we reached out to. On the other hand, I will say we did have 100 plus over 100 applications, and so I think our biggest problem wasn't outreach, although, as they said, we can do better, but it was on the hand-holding end, not doing enough to assist people who got stuck, and that's part of the change that we hope to make.
John, since I have you speaking now, why don't we hop onto that question of any gaps in interest and uptake to the program, and specifically changes you're making moving forward, and if any of those are going to be specifically to the different requirements or the priority categories that you had initially created.
Definitely. We are dropping the priority for households with children, not because we no longer think they're important, but we think that one of the obstacles we created in doing that was a need to hold on to applications till we came to the end of the process to do a lottery. And so the major change we're making is switching over to a first come, first served model, which is probably more common. And what that means is we're also going to have a simpler pre-application rather than asking people to do the full application online. And we're going to work harder at helping people to get through the full application, and see us as needing to do that one by one in a more efficient and effective way, so that at the end of the day, we are enrolling people in the program as quickly as we can, as opposed to kind of waiting to the end. I think that's the biggest single change that we're making. We're also added families that might be receiving another source of rental support if they're in arrears. So that would assist them with paying for back rent. So that's another change. And let's see. Yeah, I think overall, we're just going to have a more streamlined approach. There are a few other things that are just minor changes to what we're doing, but the biggest change is to focus more on hand-holding, and really that's the responsibility of Community Action Pioneer Valley. They do have resource advocates to talk to people on the phone Unfortunately, their usual way of doing business, which is to meet people in person, is excluded for the same reason that we have this huge problem through the pandemic.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, John. Yeah, I think that's frustrated all of us. Although I have heard of some programs actually having people do drive-by application completion, so that, you know, for some people who do need a little bit more handholding or assistance completing the documentation, that's an option that's out there, or walk by if you're in a more walkable community. I wanted to pose kind of a similar question to Kristen. You know, was that some of the conversation that led to the creation of IRMA, looking at gaps in who you could assist, in how you created that program?
Yeah, definitely. I think there, you know, historically has been a recognition that, you know, RAFT can only serve folks at 50% AMI or below. And so there were often folks just over that or beyond that income bracket who would go unserved. So we really wanted to target the IRMA funds to folks in that 50 to 80% AMI group. I will say we've been surprised. Uptake has been slower than expected for IRMA. I think, you know, the feedback we've gotten from our regional agencies is that they're getting tons of inquiries, you know, people calling saying, I'm looking for IRMA, I want to apply for IRMA. But when they actually get through the application process, it turns out that their income is below 50% AMI. So it's actually RAFT that's going to be the more appropriate program for them. So, you know, we do have flexibility with our funding. So we're open to the possibility later down the road of expanding income eligibility for IRMA to 0 to 80% AMI, you know, depending on demand and kind of available resources. So that's one area that we would potentially adapt.
Great. And Alex or Erin, anything you want to add on the changes to your programs as you move forward?
Yeah, I think one of the major lessons learned with our program relates to communications. So we received almost 1,600 applications. And because of how we categorize, or the categories of preferences, our staff had to conduct a preliminary evaluation of all 1,600 in order to, you know, determine whether or not they're eligible for the lottery before completing a deeper dive into, you know, income quals and the like. There was some time that elapsed in that process, and of course, when you're trying to disperse that sort of scale of funding, you know, there are a couple of weeks that elapse between the time a grant agreement signed and the time the check is issued or payments issued. So moving forward, we would propose establishing a communications team that's kind of separate from the program managers and program assistants. They would be intertwined with the program managers, but with the sole duty of maintaining weekly communication with applicants and with recipients. We found that many recipients of these funds, you know, were experiencing immense anxiety and have been in traumatic situations because of their housing circumstances, coupled with the impact of COVID-19. So we do want to be extremely sensitive to that and make sure that we're communicating on at least a weekly basis with them. It does seem somewhat excessive in the context of other programs, but in our round 2 of the rental assistance program, which we seek to launch on October 1st, our plan is to either provide stipends to trusted community members who could fulfill that communications role, or to hire part-time staff or contractors in our department to do that.
And I would just add, while Arlington did not see the sort of demand that Amherst or Chelsea has seen in our first round, although I'm launching our second round tomorrow, and I do feel like we will be hit with a larger amount of demand. But the point I wanted to make, and it sort of goes to capacity, is it's me and the admin in my department and our administrator, MCO Housing Services, working on this. So it's really like 4-ish people. And it goes to Alex's point about communication, is that I intentionally gave us enough time to be able to process checks going through the town accounting system, which can be lengthy in some cases, and in other cases not so lengthy, primarily because we had to make all of the landlords vendors. But making sure that you clearly communicate the timeframes to the applicants, I found was the most important thing, because like Alex's experience, I did receive phone calls and emails of very anxious residents wondering when they'll see a check or when their landlord would see a check. So I'll be continuing to, implement that in our second round, but definitely don't overpromise, and give yourself and your staff enough time to go through all the steps that are needed to cut a check from a municipal office.
Yeah, great point. Stephanie, I know you wanted to speak on this as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to add in that if towns aren't seeing a huge number of applications, that doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't a huge amount of demand. And this is where we have the problem of, if there's multiple doors for, me, Stephanie, as a constituent to get some kind of assistance, and we're not necessarily talking to each other in terms of databases, it could be that more people are being served by your regional administering agency on the RAFT or ERMA side. And that's why those emergency rental assistance funds aren't being tapped as much, right? Because people already have some kind of resource. And that's why it's really, valuable for those sort of moving forward, in terms of launching a program, to consider working with their regional administering agency, because they can then just play matchmaker and figure out what the right program is, rather than having that sort of confusion for both the consumer, but as well as for the town, in terms of being able to ascertain actual demand. And a lot of this comes down to the timelines of when money needs to be spent by, right? Thanks.
Thank you, Stephanie. Yes, that's a great point. And I know there's been some questions in the comments about, our towns using outside agencies to administer their programs. There's definitely a need for this communication. And also this comment we've heard time and time again, that there should be no wrong front door. If someone comes to any one of these locations looking for assistance, we should make sure they find their way, and they're eligible, we should make sure they find their way to the assistance. And so that communication is really so critical. I want to circle back to a couple more specific challenges that we know folks are facing in administering a program in the midst of a pandemic. The question of income certification has come up, and I think a couple of you have touched on this before, of, how are you handling income certification in the midst of a pandemic, documenting, easing requirements, and also now that some folks may have been out of work but are maybe going back to work. They might have rent arrearages that they haven't been able to pay. So are you exploring ways to assist with that? Anyone want to take that first? Maybe Amy, do you want to talk to that from RAFT's perspective?
Sure, yeah. So this is definitely a challenge. We obviously still need to verify income for RAFT because the state budget language says that we have to serve households with income up to 50% AMI or up to 60% AMI for folks facing domestic violence. So we need to know what their income is, but what we've heard on the ground from the regional agencies is, this is always kind of a challenge getting people's income, and it's a lot harder right now where folks are trying to do this over email, texting photos of their pay stubs to their caseworker. It can just really take a while. We did add a self-certification option for both RAFT and ERMA, where folks can just self-certify their income, write down what they get monthly, and sign off, and we don't look for backup on that. We are still sort of hearing that it's kind of challenging still to either get that form back, or people, will maybe look for their pay stubs for a little while and then fill out the form, and that takes up time at on the staff side. So one of the things we're kind of exploring now is whether there's a way to have the best of both worlds, except less documentation. Maybe it's one pay stub with a self-certification, kind of getting that up front. We've looked at maybe building the self-certification right into the application so that we're not doing it kind of twice. So we're still trying to figure out the best way forward with that. But yeah, it's definitely I think the old days of asking for 4 pay stubs and current income within 60 days, we're finding it's just not really feasible to do, at least not quickly during the pandemic.
Dana, I'll just add that the issue of documentation is of great concern to us, primarily because, as I said earlier, we're relying on funds that originate with the Community Preservation Act. And that means that at some point, the State Department of Revenue may come in and say, okay, did you have effective or the documentation that we think you should have had in order to have made these awards? So we're kind of stuck between wanting to be sure that we get people into the program, and on the other hand, wanting to be sure that the supervising state agencies won't say at the end of the day, no, you shouldn't have spent the money that way, and we're not going to allow it. Anybody has a good solution to that, I'd like to know it.
For the Chelsea program, we had a self-certification form for household income with income limits set at 50% AMI. We did request copies of leases or letters from landlords verifying tenancy. It's a tough balance to weigh. I guess we run a number of federal housing programs with rigorous income qualification processes where 8 weeks of pay, assets and the like are required, and those programs serve a certain constituency. The rental assistance program, in our experience, has served a constituency that, quite honestly, doesn't feel comfortable sharing that information with government. Many of them are in employment situations that may not be with documentation. So, we were quite cognizant of those special circumstances, and in order to cast the widest net possible, try to shrink the barriers to entry. Our intention is to fund a second round of the program utilizing our local COVID-19 emergency funds that we received through the Commonwealth's COVID-19 stabilization fund, and we'll be doing a self-certification again with a couple of tweaks. I think we encountered a few instances of cases that required supplemental documentation to validate income. There was a lot of confusion about what household income means in the era of COVID. If somebody was making $50,000 this time last year or even 3 months ago, but they're unemployed now, how is that calculated? So we'll be leading off the next round with a some targeted messaging to help define some of those terms and clarify those questions.
Thanks everyone for your comments on that. A couple of folks have mentioned landlords, and so it brings me to my next question is, how are you engaging landlords in this work? Are you exploring a landlord application or a landlord-based program, or are you asking for any concessions from landlords? John, do you want to start us off there?
Sure. One of the ways we're doing outreach is because Amherst has a rental registration program, we have email addresses and other addresses for every single landlord in Amherst. I think it's close to 600. That's what happens when you have a major university in your backyard. So we did inform landlords about the program and encourage them to encourage their tenants to apply. We're now at the place with our round 1 awardees of doing the final paperwork with landlords. I won't say they've exactly been resistant, but again, because it's a university town, we're in September, it's a time when they're very busy bringing new people into apartments and other units. So sometimes they're not as responsive as we would like to be. The last thing that I'll mention is after a landlord is in the program, we send them a letter asking them if they would agree to do a certain amount of rental forgiveness up to the amount that we are providing as rental assistance. At this point, we have yet to actually send out a single letter. So I don't know what the response will be, but once we do know, we will let people know how successful or unsuccessful it's been.
Thanks, John. Erin, have you guys explored anything working directly with landlords in Arlington?
We haven't. As I had mentioned in my response to a previous question, is in terms of the capacity in the office, it was something that we chose not to go down that path, just because we don't have the staff to look after those agreements and to facilitate that, among all the other things that we're working on right now. So no, but I generally have engaged with a number of the landlords whose tenants did apply for funding. And in most cases, the landlord was happy and excited to see that they would be receiving a payment on behalf of their tenant. But it was just something that was a little bit beyond the capacity that we had in our department at the time when we launched the program.
That's a good point, and I know there have been questions about capacity and staffing, and I wanted to pose this question to Stephanie as kind of a very broad. How are folks managing the amount of work it takes to process this number of applications coming in, especially at the regional housing network agencies that are taking in a lot of new applications?
Well, as I mentioned, we have worked with DHCD and continue to work with DHCD to shorten the workflow. That's a big piece of it, right? We are in the process of hoping to, so there has already been some staffing up, and most of our agencies are just holding off on when we get notification on when supplemental budget funds will become available and what those amounts will be per agency to determine how much they can then, put towards staffing resources, which is really critical. I think when you're talking about this scale of an issue, you really need to look at making sure that you have the staffing capacity, as has been mentioned, to not only be able to handhold, but process through the application, to communicate with the client, and to get the checks cut at the door, to talk to the landlord. I mean, so there's a lot of moving pieces that go along with this. And so I'll say, generally that we feel it's really important for, folks to be looking at the setting of expectations around this, right? And also, getting people to understand, like, if there's a lot of families ahead of you, it's really important that you get in line now and not wait until the eviction moratorium, whether that's October 17th or December 31st. And that's kind of a question that's TBD right now, but that you get in line now, because there's no guarantee of funds. And so we really think that is critical for people to do now. And just sort of looping back to, the question of engagement with landlords, I'll say that the Regional Housing Network has been speaking with Mass Landlords Association and the Small Property Owners Association, and we're working right now on a front door of a statewide, website that will be able to direct people to exactly where they need to go, give them the basics, of information. We've recognized again that what worked for 6 months or a year ago isn't necessarily going to work for when the moratorium lifts. So those are some of the efforts that we're engaging in. And I think, though, we've had conversations about, like, how much of a haircut can you ask a landlord to take before you start to have, a deleterious effect on their willingness to accept the application, right, to accept the funds, and when they kind of get to the point where they've had enough. And that's a fine line. So I would definitely encourage people to speak with landlords, landlord attorneys, that sort of thing in their area, to get some advice on that.
Thank you. And thank you for the work on, bringing everyone to the table in that effort. I wanted to ask a question. So often short-term rental assistance is tied to questions of sustainability. I wanted to circle back to Kristen and Amy and see if there's been any discussion about that, given how unknowable our current situation is, and can any of us really feel like we're in a sustainable situation? How are you handling that?
Yeah, so for both RAFT and IRMA, we're not requiring sustainability right now. We fully recognize that many households are still struggling and might not be back to work for quite a while. So we know that requiring sustainability wouldn't really make sense. But sort of following up on what Stephanie was saying, what we are exploring from a policy perspective is, how we can partner with landlords to prevent evictions and sustain tenancies. So, as I mentioned earlier, we're having lots of conversations internally at DHCD and with stakeholders about, how best to accomplish that goal of preserving tenancies.
Great, thank you. So I think I have time for one more question to all of you, and then I'm going to hand it off to Chris to ask some questions from the audience. So the question has come up in the chat a couple times, and you all have mentioned it. What's going to happen with the end of the eviction moratorium? Any thoughts you all have to share? And obviously on top of this now, there's not just the state eviction moratorium, there's the federal eviction moratorium that's slightly different and covers slightly different components, but we've got an October deadline on the state one, a December deadline on the federal one. Are you anticipating a rush on these funds? Are you prepping in any way? Any thoughts? Maybe we'll start with you, Kristen, since we've got you up to respond.
Sure. Amy, did you want to respond to this one? I know.
Or Amy, sorry, Kristen, to put you on the spot.
Sorry. No. Yeah, I would just say, demand's already been really high. We anticipate it's going to get, there'll be another spike in applications once the moratorium or the moratoriums. And so, like Stephanie said earlier, we're definitely doing everything we can to encourage people to apply now and not wait. We don't really know what future funding will look like. We know what we have now, and we know that it's not probably going to be enough to help everyone who might be behind on rent. And so, we want the word out there that you don't need to wait until you get a court summons. We would prefer you don't wait until you get a court summons. We're working with the RAs to staff up and streamline our application so that we're ready to go when that happens.
How about folks at the local level? Are you changing your conversation with folks anticipating that eviction moratorium ending?
I was going to say, we haven't done anything yet, but we'll know where we stand at the end of round 2. Honestly, we didn't know what the demand would be when we embarked on this, but we thought that the amount of funds we allocated might not be enough and that we would need to extend or expand the program. So we'll be looking at that as we approach the end of round 2. We do believe we now have additional funds available, so that as we approach the end of round 2, we'll be looking at creating essentially, I guess, around 3 or around 4, because what people say is that one reason why we've had a lot of incomplete applications is people aren't worried enough yet about the eviction problem, and that they're going to become more worried as we move ahead.
I'll also just add that once HUD released their federal notice about the CARES Act CDBG funding, they increased the rental assistance limit from 3 months to 6 months. So we are changing our program and allowing returning applicants to come back for another 3 months of assistance with the funding through the CDBG program. And then they can come back when we start to use the CPA funding. So we're looking to make sure that we can help people to the maximum that we can with the funding that we have locally.
So in Chelsea, we're not dramatically altering the sort of programmatic structure or architecture of the program. We are committing an additional $1.2 million to round 2, which is equivalent to the amount of funding that we seeded round 1 with. We are advancing initiatives that are complementary to the round 2 of the program. The major one is that we will be establishing and standing up a housing legal clinic over the next 2 weeks. So the city has coordinated with local community leaders to establish a nonprofit legal services agency that will provide representation to Chelsea tenants facing evictions. So we expect that many of the applicants that applied for round one and were not awarded funds, applied for round one or may have been awarded funds, will be referred to our new legal services clinic, either for landlord-tenant mediation or for trial representation. And the clinic provides us with an opportunity to assist tenants negotiating the amount of rental debt that they owe, and attempt to kind of decrease that balance for tenants to either size that's manageable and can be addressed through our program or addressed through a mix of tenants' contribution in our program. Ultimately, we're expecting sort of a spate of evictions come this fall. We're also committing approximately $500,000 to an emergency housing scattered sites initiative, sort of as a program of last resort in order to provide some form of shelter or emergency housing for Chelsea residents. So we expect that this round two will be overdrawn. We've requested additional funding through various sources. Our community-based partners are also actively advocating to the state for additional resources. I think when we last calculated the level of unmet need in round one, we were left with approximately $9 million in unmet need. That's only worsened from when that calculation was completed around 2 months ago. So we're actively pursuing additional funding and trying to stand up these other housing resources as quickly as possible.
Thank you, Alex. And that's sobering to hear that number. I think, it puts in perspective how much work you've already done, but how much work there still is to be done. So I want to thank all our panelists, but you're not done yet, because I'm going to hand it off to Chris Kletchman. The questions have been coming in fast and furious. So Chris, if you want to start posing some questions from the audience, thanks.
Sure, thank you everybody. What a great conversation it's been so far. And I'm doing my best to try and pick out some of the most frequently asked questions for our panelists. And I think I'm going to start with something that came up for Amy and Kristen related to RAFT and IRMA. Questions about, has somebody who received RAFT funding, are they precluded from getting IRMA benefits? And could you talk a little bit about how those two programs either do work together or don't work together?
Sure. So our policy on that is that a household can't access more than $4,000 across the two programs within a 12-month period. So there is that restriction. We're also not, I know people's incomes are kind of in flux right now. We're not sure how much movement there would be anyways, like across the income bracket. So it may not be that common, but that is our policy, that you can't access more than a total of $4,000 across the two programs within a year.
Thank you. Question for the municipal folks, and I will start with Alex and then maybe Aaron and then John. What periods do your programs cover? Did you go back earlier than April? Are you going forward? What are the typical durations, and have you changed that over the course of your program? And let's start with Alex Tring.
So our program is designed to offer up to 3 months of rental assistance or $5,000, whichever is the lesser amount. We'll likely adjust that and increase that $5,000 to something around $600 or $6,500. So it is more reflective of what 3 months worth of rent actually costs. But the rent that we would consider covering was from the date of the declaration of a public health emergency onward. We did provide in our program guidelines the latitude to consider rental arrearages that spanned longer in duration before the public health emergency. We honestly haven't had to exercise any of that discretion just yet because the few that have been brought to our attention, it was clear that there weren't going to be sort of benefits to address those arrears while, without addressing the, rent that's owed at this given time. So we don't think we're going to change any of that. We do think we'll probably adjust the amounts of money released to cover a 3 to 4 month period.
Thanks, Alex. How about you, Erin?
Yeah, so the funding was for future rents. So after an approval came from my department, but I had mentioned at the start of the webinar that there were 2 other relief funds that are still operating in Arlington, one through the Housing Corporation of Arlington and the other through our Health and Human Services Department's charitable corporation. So working with those administrators, we cross-referenced applicants to understand what the need is of those applicants. And although I couldn't pay for arrears, the private donations that funded partially the HCA program and the charitable corporations program could be used for arrears and other household expenses that might have been a struggle for the client. So we tried to make sure that through the 3 funds, we could cover someone's need and get them up to date, or as close to up to date as we could.
And I'll just say, I think that we would allow people to go back as far as April, but in our initial applications, we haven't seen people being very far behind for the most part. So that hasn't been an issue. On the other hand, going forward, we think we probably will need to extend the program from 3 months to 6 months. So that's something we'll be looking at as we get through round 2.
Sounds like what you're hearing from folks is that some of the lessons learned is to be flexible and to be able to pivot if you need to, as the realities of your particular community unfold on the ground. Stephanie, I have some questions for you. There's been a lot of questions, and I think one of the important issues here is the communication with landlords, as everybody has emphasized. And there was a question about a landlord seeking assistance for a tenant if the tenant is uncomfortable, or if there's something else going on where the landlord may be more in a position to, whether because of language or other things, more in a position to complete an application. Can you reflect what's the policies in the regional for the RAAs about landlords applying for tenants?
So I'm actually going to defer to Amy or Kristen on this one because we implement their policies.
Okay.
But I will say just generally that most of the RAs have reached out to the major landlords in their area, and we welcome their assistance.
Okay. Amy and Kristen, to you.
Yeah, so right now we don't have a policy that would allow a landlord to submit an application directly for a tenant. It is something that's been discussed and explored. I don't want to rule it out for the future, but there's just some other challenges that we've found kind of when we think through how we would implement something like that. But in the meantime, yeah, we certainly encourage landlords to help tenants put together an application, to even, get the application for them, provide it to them, to the extent that landlords can help with the process. That's definitely appreciated.
Yeah. Thanks for the clarification. As somebody who I've talked to about their emergency rental assistance programs has said, every application is actually 2 different sources of information. Since many assistance programs are funding landlords directly, you need both the landlord and the tenant to be on the same page, and you need information from both of them. So each application is actually 2 sets of information that you have to seek. Just again, as you've heard here today, lots of process, and make sure you're allowing for that. Amy and Kristen, while I have you on the spot, there was a late-breaking question about the new $28 million that's been announced related from HUD for DHCD. And do you have any information about DHCD's plans, or is it just wait and see?
Yeah, definitely wait and see. We don't have any info, and it's sort of above our pay grade, I think.
Okay. Good. Well, DHCD has been moving through just lots and lots of funding. And so one of the reasons that the agency is involved in these conversations and in the database is so that we understand what's going on at the local level so that we can more appropriately balance the federal resources that are going through the states. Let's see. There's a question about, and I think this is an interesting concept, which is for the local folks, are any of your programs assisting public housing tenants or people who are already in subsidized or deed restricted housing? And I'll start with you, Erin.
Yeah, we are helping folks that are in deed restricted housing or in units that are owned by our housing authority. Side benefit of it is that it has improved my relationship with a number of the staff members at the housing authority in terms of information sharing and understanding their processes and our processes. So yes, we are helping those applicants, although we do encourage them to seek a change in their income status to lower their rent as well.
Okay. How about you, Alex? Uh-oh.
Sorry,
there we go.
Here I am. My computer froze. My apologies. Can you say that last part again?
Sure. Looking for what Chelsea is doing to assist, if anything, public housing tenants or people who are already in subsidized housing or deed restricted housing of one sort or another.
Yeah. So in our program, sort of our approach categorized public housing or voucher recipients in sort of the following categories. So we dealt with recipients of housing choice vouchers and Massachusetts rental vouchers. For those instances, we contacted the agency that issued the vouchers to inquire about the viability of a rental adjustment. If there were cases where the tenant experienced a loss of income or reduction in income, that would often achieve the desired result of delivering assistance to that resident without expending precious local resources. For public housing, similarly, the Chelsea Housing Authority was open to considering requests for rental adjustments. We referred tenants to the Chelsea Housing Authority for that purpose. But then there's other sort of deed restricted housing that has, a 30-year AHR on it, but it isn't inhabited by a voucher holder. They just pay a sort of affordable rent. For those deed restricted units that were not subject to any voucher programs, we did seek to assist those tenants. Our local community development partner, the neighborhood developers, worked very diligently with the city. The neighborhood developers actually were able to absorb about 50% of the cost of the assistance that was requested by their tenants who were selected in our lottery, with the city shouldering the other 50%. So that was really an exemplary sort of demonstration of how public and private resources could be used to achieve sort of a stabilizing result without depleting all of the resources we have in the program.
That's great, thank you. John, do you have anything to add for?
Yeah, I mean, we had restricted our program so that people in housing subsidy programs were not eligible. Looking through the applications, there were a few people who came from housing subsidy programs and were in arrears with respect to their rental obligations. So we have expanded the eligibility so that it would allow us to use our money to pay arrears, but not to pay funds going forward. As Alex and I think Erin both mentioned, we would assume they'd go through the normal process of looking for rent adjustments.
Great, okay. I'm noticing, again, during the panel conversation, I was trying to take note of the queue of the questions that were coming up. I'm noticing as this conversation is going that there's a fair amount of conversation about the Community Preservation Act, or CPA and CPC, and there have been some answers. I do want to say that obviously the group, the kind of core group here, the three agencies work closely with the Community Preservation Committee. We talked to Stuart Saginaw about some of these issues. We've tried to be clear, and I think if and when we do a follow-up survey, we want to get some more information about the funding sources. We kind of asked the general questions about CPA or housing trust, and we think we need to be a little bit more targeted with our questions in the survey. But obviously CPA has been crucial for many of the programs here. And I just thank you for those that are answering the questions in the chat, so that's an important resource. Let's see, Amy and Kristen, a question specifically to Irma. So I think this is going to be Kristen. Does IRMA cover homeowners insurance, taxes, insurance, or utilities? And could you comment on some of these non-rent payments?
Yeah, that's something that our regional agencies asked us about early on that we hadn't necessarily crafted a policy around. You know, the items you mentioned, like condo fees, taxes, and insurance. We're still figuring out exactly what our policy will be around this. The other sort of issue that we've been wrestling with, and I saw someone mention this in the chat, like homeowners have access to a lot of protections right now and may not be at as imminent risk as renters. And so that was sort of another like lesson learned. You know, we've been doing a lot of sort of, I guess, research to figure out the landscape of protections that homeowners have access to, just to make sure that because our funds are so limited, we want to make sure we're targeting them at the folks who are, again, at most imminent risk of losing their homes. So that's definitely something that we're trying to come out with a more nuanced policy on, to figure out if we can cover those other kinds of expenses.
Thank you so much. So there's been a fair amount of conversation and questions about undocumented renters and the difficulty in getting some of their documentation. And I think, Alex, just to warn you, this question is going to eventually land with you. But I do think that one of the things I'm hearing is there are certainly a whole set of best practices for communications that is, I think we can highlight and maybe on the housing toolbox really emphasize. And it sounds like those are emerging, and there are some communities that are doing a fantastic job, Easton, you know, other folks. But as you're communicating with undocumented folks, Alex, and I don't know, Stephanie, if you guys have some lessons learned as well, could you just share briefly some of your the lessons that you've learned?
Sure. There were a multitude. So I'm a, white, well-educated male. So I've learned pretty much from the ground up from my colleagues in Chelsea, who have kindly kind of taken me under their wing to teach me a lot of their best practices. And I think Aaron touched on this earlier, but not just translating materials into multiple languages, but really distilling complex terminology and complicated materials into either highly visual media or something that's easily understandable and digestible was a key sort of part of our success. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, other lessons learned include ensuring that we're employing communication contractors or staff that are trusted members of the community. The city of Chelsea espouses this community block captain sort of model that we created in our climate resiliency planning, that we're now beginning to expand to other arenas of urban planning and design, where we engage trusted community leaders who help us disseminate information, and they also serve to aggregate information and relay it to the city. So it's kind of that two-way channel of feedback. we're hoping to really replicate that at a scalable level for the second round, where we have folks working for us that the community knows and trusts. I think ultimately what we continually emphasize and underscore relates to keeping information confidential, keeping information away from the federal government. There are a slew of difficulties because of mass public records law when it comes to personal information. Our interpretation has been that much of the information supplied in these programs is personal and therefore can be kept confidentially. But we are quite careful with how we ask certain questions and what we ask. We don't ask about immigration status. We don't ask about citizenship. We simply have to constantly echo in all of our public media that those are factors that we do not look at, we do not care about, and we ask our community partners to help amplify that message. So it's a lot of sort of reiterating the same messages of making sure that people feel comfortable eventually to apply for the program. But I think we have a lot of work to do ahead. I think it's imperfect, and we have been relatively successful in this program compared to other programs, but we still have sort of miles ahead to go.
Thank you so much. And Stephanie, is there anything else that you need to add in a short way, because we're almost out of time and we need to let folks go?
I think that Alex covered it pretty well. Just that we need to make sure we're communicating both that these funds don't count towards the public charge roll. That's a big concern. And also that information isn't going to be communicated to immigration officials. That is a real concern as well.
Great. Thank you very much. Dana, I'm going to shift it back to you.
Thank you, Kristen. So I just want to close it out. Thank you, everyone, for sticking with us. I just want to thank all the speakers for joining us here today, but more importantly, for the incredible work you're all doing, keeping people housed and keeping people safe. And it's not just the roof over their head, but it's the stress of not knowing how you're going to keep the roof over your head that so many people are dealing with right now. So really incredible work you're all doing. Please check our website. We will be posting this recording. I know many of you have colleagues who wanted to join us but couldn't. We will be putting contacts for all of the speakers on there as well. I know there were a lot of questions that weren't answered today, so please feel free to reach out to us. We'll do our best to answer as many of those and post those answers as well. And just a final reminder to check out the website. Reminder about the database and all of the tools that are on the housing toolbox. Shelly Gehring got a shout out from John, but she did a lot of work putting together all of the FAQs and best practices that launched us on our first session back in April, when many of you first started thinking about this. And so we're going to continue to update and add to all of the resources that are there. From a CHAPA perspective, just a reminder that we have our annual dinner coming up on October 21st. If you want to join us for that, that will be remote. And with that, I'm just going to say thank you, and please reach out if you have any further questions. Thanks so much, everyone.